Welcome to the Scaleup Valley podcast, where we bring the best founders and investors to help you scale a business from 1 million to 1 trillion. Today's guests are Klaus and Aaron, the co-authors of the book Global Class, and of course also involved in a series of ventures in the tech ecosystem. But let's start by getting to know more about themselves. Klaus, Aaron, who would like to start?
Oh, well, Mike, thanks so much for having us. This is Aaron for everyone listening. For my background, I'm a Silicon Valley native. I started my career at AT&T as part of its leadership development program, sort of future C-levels. Officers, was one of the youngest to serve as regional VP, but I always knew in my heart that I was an entrepreneur. And so I did basically the whole decade I was there. I did a bunch of side businesses, a real eclectic mix from custom wedding invitations to portable beer pong tables to a taxi app that came out around the same time Uber did. Eventually, I left to be a serial entrepreneur, started a few more ventures. A few failed, 3 got acquired. And then about 6 years ago, was asked to teach entrepreneurship at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business, where I still teach. And then about 4 years ago, Klaus and I teamed up on a venture called 10X Innovation Lab.
And my name is Klaus. And Aaron is very curious when it comes to building startups and exploring technologies. I'm very curious when it comes to exploring the world. So I've lived and worked on 4 different continents: Santiago, Chile, Hanoi, Vietnam, from Denmark, and now in Silicon Valley. What I did in Vietnam was particularly interesting. I helped lead product launch strategy for one of the largest beer brewing companies in the world, and really got the first chance to kind of see how even the largest organizations are challenged when it comes to building a global organization. In fact, the company I worked for and represented back then had been there since the mid-90s. And in around 2011 and 12, they fired the whole team there locally because they still weren't successful in that market. They had wasted a lot of time and money in the process. And so after that journey, I wanted to go to Silicon Valley to sort of flex the entrepreneurial and innovation muscle. And so I quickly came over here and joined an organization called Silicon Valley Forum, which actually was one of the oldest nonprofits promoting innovation and entrepreneurship. And there I was responsible for launching a lot of acceleration programs within international government organizations. And that was sort of the first sort of visibility into also how startup founders have a lot of challenges when it comes to actually expanding to new markets.
Definitely, and we have that in common. Also, I've been covering kind of Europe, the US, Latam, Southeast Asian, the APAC region. Only missing here to have more representation from African founders and entrepreneurs. But the time will come, I'm sure, and I'm committed in the future to have also that representation in this 240 plus episodes. So far, and it's really a pleasure to have you both on the show, and especially to talk about the topic that I love, right? How to build a global company. We know that a lot of companies go very local or even very regional in the majority of the cases. Very few companies are able to really go global. But before talking too much about it, would love to know from the authors, why did you decide to write the book, and why everyone should listen or should read the book or listen to the book? That's true nowadays with the audiobooks.
Right. I mean, it really came from our past experiences, right? A little bit of the journey I had with Vietnam, but also when launching all these acceleration programs, basically seeing founders make the same mistakes all the time. And that sort of gave us the initial idea to think about writing a book. But then also we didn't want to just write from our own experiences. We wanted to add other people's experiences into the mix as well. And so I remember in the early days, I said to Aaron, let's talk to 30 executives. And Aaron back then, he was like, maybe only 10 people will speak to us. And literally within 3 weeks, we have 50 meetings in place with everything from, someone like Abe Smith, who leads international at Zoom, to the former VP of international at Apple, who managed a $100 billion P&L, all the way down to the first hire outside of North America of Uber, who launched 5 different markets in Asia, to founders in Bangladesh to Indonesia, whatever, really trying to understand what make them successful and or not successful. And so we went on this quest to kind of, find patterns to kind of be able to build this playbook for building a global organization. And we're excited to share that with you guys today. Aaron?
And definitely people would be thinking for themselves, why the hell should we talk about Apple and those very big companies? Maybe they don't relate to some of the founders that are listening to the show, but it makes a lot of sense in my perspective. And I've kind of expanded even my scaling up research or my scaling up passion when I thought, how do we get from 0 to 1 million, from 1 to 10, then from 10 to 100, from 100 to 1B, like the kind of the path of Zoom nowadays. And then how do we get from 1B to 10B, and from 10B to 100B, and then we have 500B with Walmart, and Apple is getting closer and closer. So which I think it's around, didn't see the last global Fortune 500 numbers, but around 250 or 300 billion in revenue. So this allows us to think that this is all about scaling up, and those companies were very small at a certain time. And it also shows that global expansion takes a while to build a global company. Aaron, you wanted to
to that point, also to clarify, when we did much of this research, the people we spoke to were the people who started those expansions. So even though there are big names that we recognize like Airbnb and Slack and other companies, the people we interviewed were the people who were there at the very beginning, who were the real catalyst behind the expansion. So yes, we recognize these big global brands, and part of it is because of the work of these people that we spoke with, and we can talk about it in a bit, but we call them entrepreneurs, as in international, a concept that we came up with.
Entrepreneurs, oh, got it. Now I understand what I saw on your website of the book. That's definitely a great one. And so what has been some of the most fascinating or the most interesting stories that you have heard? So any intriguing special stories that you'd like to share?
I mean, we have lots of stories. I'll maybe share the DocuSign story, then maybe Aaron can talk about the Walmart story afterwards, because you addressed it a couple of minutes ago. But one story that we share is DocuSign when they were expanding to Japan. And so DocuSign could easily have gone what we label in the book the company way of doing things, basically applying what they've learned in their initial market and just push it through the new market that they want to enter into. But instead, they actually have that, cultural empathy and cultural understanding enough to understand that they had to adapt the platform and the company to be able to scale into Japan. As an example, DocuSign is a signature company. And in Japan, they do hanko stamps, which is like a wooden piece where you press it down on the piece of paper, and that is your signature essentially. So they partner with a company called Shachihata, which is not a digital company at all. It is literally the company that makes these hanko stamps. Partner with them, created what they call e-hanko, shared a part of their economics with them, and then later scale into the market. And so they were very culturally conscious when it came to actually expanding into a market that's very challenging for most companies, right? But we're successful. And so, really understanding you need to adapt your business to be able to scale is really, really important.
Klaus had mentioned Walmart, and we actually kick off the first chapter of our book talking about how Walmart wanted to do things the company way and attempted to implement this sort of American way of doing business in Germany when they expanded. They bought a couple of companies, and there were a number of them, but three that we key in on of things that they sort of insisted on doing in the German market was one, the value proposition was around low prices, especially with like groceries. Well, in the German market, they had very low prices already, so it wasn't really that compelling. And there was no real way to get supply chain advantages to make prices lower. Then in US, packaged meat is very normal, but in Germany, that's not as culturally desirable, and there's kind of a lack of trust. Like, what is this other Walmart, Sam's Club brand? And then finally, and probably most interestingly, was culturally in Walmart. For those who've been there, they're very friendly when you enter the door. They're like welcome and very friendly at the cashier and everything. And that kind of freaked Germans out, right? They were like, they're used to like shopping at their own pace, doing their own thing, and they're like, who is this person? And so the company failed.
Leave me alone.
Yeah, and they lost, over $1 billion in the process.
And just to share my personal story when coming to the US as well, it was weird to me going into supermarkets in the US because people wanted to pack my bags. And so I was in the mindset, no, these are my groceries. I picked them out. You should not pack my bags at all. I want to do it myself because we're just used to doing that. We're used to doing things pretty much on our own when we're going to the supermarket, right? So it's like this interesting cultural experience that you need to make sure that you understand when you enter into new markets.
Love it.
I was going to offer one additional story, but like with a focus on something that's practical. So for those from America who are listening, you probably have never heard of this company, but everywhere else in the world you probably have, and that's BlaBlaCar, world's largest carpooling platform. And we interviewed a number of times Frederick Mazzala, their former CEO founder, and Fred was really supportive of everything we've been doing, which we appreciate. But he shared this notion that they had internally that I think he was the driver behind, that he called building for two markets. And so what they considered both the French market where they're from, as well as the Spanish market while they launched. Now, they didn't launch in both markets. Be very clear. They didn't launch in both markets because there's some dangers to that, but they considered both markets. So when it came to building the product, they thought about not just French, but also Spanish, two languages in the UI, UX. Then they thought about not just French regulations, but Spanish regulations as well. And so when you consider, when it comes to the product, the team, the culture, the processes, if you focus on building for multiple markets, you're not hard coding it just for your first market. And when you hard code it just for your first market, then it becomes very hard to add a second market and third and fourth because everything is so customized for that market. But if you build in flexibility, then it's much easier. The other thing they did in particular was they hired people from Spain who then moved to the office in France. And so during the strategy building process and development process, they had this insight for the Spanish market. It wasn't just what they thought would happen in Spain, but they had that influence. And then that team had that great company knowledge that then they were able to take with them to pair with the local knowledge to then be successful for when they did launch in Spain.
And that speaks actually to one of the issues that we often stumble upon with executives that are looking at expanding to new markets. Sometimes we engage with them and they say, no, we're not going to expand until a year from now. So we're not ready to have a conversation. But in fact, they should have the conversation right now because there's also a lot of internal capability building you need to do as well. To Aaron's example, in terms of bringing in international minded talent that could be that link into that market, making sure you can build that muscle a little bit earlier so you set yourself up for success in the future. And so oftentimes it's almost like, now we're ready, now we're going to push the speeder, but in fact you actually need to slowly build up before that and not just rush it as soon as you are planning to fully launch in that market. So it's really about capability building for us as well.
This is very interesting because it's super aligned with something that I've also learned in my journey, which was I was very strict about the entrepreneurs that I would work with. So they should have at least $1 million in revenue, at least 50 people for me to be interested in working with them and starting implementing the scaling up framework. And then I understood that they might fill in the match the requirements. But then if they add a bad startup stage, they are not ready to scaling up. So sometimes we need even to start creating some of those foundations a little bit earlier in order to prepare the company to scale up, which is very aligned with what you are saying. And something also very interesting that I've learned as well, and I'm sure that is super related with international expansion, is that product market fit in a market or in a product is not product market fit in a new market. And we are already with that mindset that we are scaling up, and it's all about, and we talk about adding markets and adding segments and adding products as it would be super easy, right? It's almost creating a new company from scratch again. And again, looking into the projections that we are trying to do also in the Excel spreadsheet, that we can put everything that we want there. We know how hard it takes and how unpredictable it is to get from 0 to 1. It is more predictable to get from 1 to 3, 3 to 5. Then from 5 to 10, maybe we can find the growth plateau and we are not able to get to the next stage and we need to reinvent the wheel. And those kind of companies, this is the majority of the companies. Let's say that what we are talking about are the outliers, the ones, the Slacks of life, the new company that made it in less than 1 year to 100 million or 10 to 100 million, something like that, right? So but definitely but as I say, it's good to know the best practices and also the common mistakes, because if we are able to implement those foundations and those pillars and those playbooks, we will be in a much better shape to be successful. But it's not a recipe that if we do that, we will be successful, because we know that those are outliers, right?
So what you're talking about is really important. And I think that what Klaus and I see as our big goal here is to take these important concepts that a lot of people with experience like you understand and put some structure behind it. Because often we were told, even those who are really experienced, they're like, how do I even describe this whole localization thing and all these things to people? So to the point you just made, we break the expansion or global growth process into 3 different stages. So there's market entry, market growth, and market maturity. So the goal of market entry is product market fit, which everybody's familiar with. We don't need to get into that. But to what you were alluding to, that the end goal, what marks the end of that market growth stage is what we call company market fit. And so that's where it's not just the product and finding the need and value proposition, other things in the market, but how have you built the company to actually support scale in that market, to support additional localizations, to basically support scale that is happening in other countries as well. So that's why we label it as company market fit, because there's a whole cultural and structural element beyond just the mechanics of the business model and the product.
And to give you just an outlier example in terms of company market fit, right? Zendesk, Danish company, as I'm sure you know, being from Europe, they chose the US market to be their initial market to scale in. And so they were located in Tenderloin, which is the area where there's a lot of homelessness in San Francisco, and they're very big on community impact. And so their community impact area, so we're naturally drawn towards homelessness in that area. But when they were then expanding into Singapore, the Singaporean employees, they were like, homelessness is not really that prevalent here, so it doesn't really resonate with us. But instead, they found out that there was a lot of senior isolation in Singapore. So they decided to change to focus on that specific area. So localization is not just about product or marketing or whatever that is. It is really considering all aspects of your business, even community impact area as well, to make sure you get that right engagement from your employees and so forth. So because we often see that people associate localization with language translation, but in our book we kind of make a much more broader sort of definition of that.
It made me remind also of an interesting topic when we were talking about Zendesk coming out of Denmark and European player going to San Francisco and expanding across the US, and also considering APAC via Singapore to expand, which is the different. I was thinking, again, the majority of the players, if they come from a very large market, from the US, from Brazil, Russia, or I'm not talking now about Russia, but China, India, etc., they don't need to get out of their domestic market, right? So, but of course, if you are coming out of Denmark, or myself out of Portugal, even with a boutique consulting company for scale-ups, I need to get out of Portugal very quickly. At the moment, I don't have a single customer in Portugal, and I'm based in Portugal. So which shows the importance of having a global mindset from day one. I even said at the time, especially 10 years ago, I only had 2 options. So I would change my business, or I would change my location, right? Because at the time we would have kind of 10 scale-ups, and I had the opportunity to work with the majority of them in Portugal. Definitely the market expanded a lot, but I think that's an interesting point. Not all companies start with a global mindset and with a global ambition. And of course, there are also more opportunistic styles that want really to get to 100 million as quickly as possible to exit the company, or even to get to 10 million and get a good exit, or to 5 million, or to 1 million, or to sell the technology and not even scale the company. Did you see any interesting patterns on those kind of founders? And especially, I think that as we have a very global community, some of them might be thinking, yes, but why do I get out of Brazil? Why the majority of the listeners are from the US, the same. But of course, the European ones would say, yes, of course, we need to start thinking global from day one, and we need to go through that decision of even expanding to the US to be able to really scale, and this can kill the company.
We're nodding our heads, because this is everything you're saying is very much exactly what we found. So first, and this is a little nuanced, but if you listen to what Klaus said when he was talking about Zendesk, he didn't use the word home market. He used the word initial market. And we very intentionally do that because the initial market may not be where you're from. Like we talk of, one of our interviews was Spotify. Spotify did choose their home market for a number of reasons. We can share that story in a bit, but a lot of other countries, or a lot of other companies, will go somewhere else. You know, Denmark, where Klaus is from, is a smaller market. You need to find another market to scale in. So the initial market piece is important. The other thing, and this is nuanced as well, but we like the way you said that, or I'll say I like the way you said that. It's about the global mindset. It's about thinking global day one. So some companies, especially early stage we talk to, will say, oh, we want to be born global. And that's not a good strategy. You will likely fail. What that just means is you're like, let's just go everywhere and see wherever we can get product market fit.
Expanding too soon, for instance.
Yeah, well, like one of the people we interviewed, Scott Coleman, who used to head international at Pinterest and was part of the international team at Google. He says that in one of the big mistakes he found in companies that he advises on expansion is they think that because they couldn't find initial product market fit where they first launched, going internationally is the right next step. And that's not. That just is kind of like another way of delaying the inevitable of, not being successful. The other piece, similar to what we're talking about, we like to say that global is the new agile. And what we mean by that is that, companies kind of got agile already. What's the next thing they're looking at? But what it really means is a lot of the patterns of what's needed for agile to be successful is very true for international. So, when you look at agile, when it started, it was all about startups. Only startups use that, larger organizations like whatever. But all of a sudden they realize this works with us too, if you're a big organization. Well, when you look at this mindset that a lot of entrepreneurs from smaller countries have about thinking global day one, like you were alluding to, an American entrepreneur from Brazil, China, they're thinking about international much later. But really, to be successful, they need to take that mindset. Just like larger organizations saw the value in agile, companies from larger markets need to see the value in that mindset that often entrepreneurs and teams from smaller markets had. Plus, everybody has to buy into this global class mindset that we've created, as opposed to this company way or country way of doing things. And then also, to the final parallel to agile, is that just like in, agile is this very iterative process that is not about building everything perfect and launching in a formal way. We see that that's where international growth is going. So the way of a company saying, let's hire 20 people and have a big office in this country and do a big ribbon cutting, that's not the way to be successful. There's so many ways for you to dip your toe in a market and test and validate first, just like you do in the agile process.
Absolutely. And I was also forgetting that, as you highlighted, it's really the mindset, because even if you come from if your initial market, I love the expression, is a very large market, you need to focus on a state or on a region or in a specific niche or on a segment. And then you need to have a different strategy for the East Coast or for the West Coast or for the Midwest, if we are talking about the US. Of course, the south of Brazil or the northern part of Brazil, it's different. I'm sure that Hangzhou or Shenzhen or Shanghai or Beijing would be also different regions to target as markets. And we also need to be able, again, to bring that diversity into the team, to be able to understand what those regions will need in terms of localization of the product, of the market. And I think this is the difficult part also, is we want to have everyone in the same location, close to each other when we are small, but at the same time, we want to have diversity in the table to be able to think a little bit ahead of the curve. And as you said, there is always this difficult thought process that entrepreneurs need to get, and I do my best to help and also to apply myself, because it's tough, which is to align the long, the mid, and the short term. Just because we have a vision for the long term and we understand how we reverse engineering that long-term vision into the mid-term and to the short term, it doesn't mean that we would be executing the long term today or even the mid-term today. It means that we are doing something in the short term that will get us closer to the midterm and the long term. What I'm saying is, if we want to be the global leader, you need to start with the continent, and within the continent, we need to start with the country, and within the country, we need to start maybe with a segment that is in different countries. If you are targeting enterprise, it's different if you are targeting enterprise or SMB or small businesses or almost B2C or B2B. So many nuances there, and then we bring into the topic that I think it's very related to international expansion, the importance of radical focus.
Totally. Maybe just to jump on one point you made earlier around diversity and then leadership commitment and focus, right? Silicon Valley is a very diverse ecosystem. It is fairly easy to tap into globally minded talent from other countries and regions, right, etc. There's other countries that do not have the same sort of possibility and opportunity to do so, because Japan as a market, you don't have the same availability. But in some of those maybe less mature markets from like a global mindset or entrepreneurial standpoint, there's an opportunity to stand out and then tap into those that exist there. As an example, Rakuten is one of the few success stories of recent tech companies that are successful globally. And one of the things that the founder Mikitani-san did was to say, okay, hey, we're going to all speak English. It's a very simple concept, but to Japan, it's a very radical concept, right? So they did what they call Englandization of the company. And so I was sitting at the office in Rakuten, I think now 1.5 months ago, and the chief well-being officer, which is a co-founder as well, he said, I knew no English in the beginning of the company. In the beginning, we did speak Japanese, but we made a commitment as a leadership team to force ourselves towards that direction, because we had the aspiration of building a global company. So part of it is also from a leadership standpoint is to get out of your comfort zone as well. And so by doing that, they were able to build a globally minded culture in a very locally minded country, which is very fascinating. But it enabled them to stand out in that locally minded country to capture the talent of globally minded people, if that makes sense, right? And so I think there's an opportunity to kind of pave the way for also the next generation of startups, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Latin America, whether it's in other regions of the world, to make that commitment to build a global organization and be able to tap into these entrepreneurs that we define in the book.
Definitely. Great point. So we kind of had the opportunity to get to know both of you a little bit on why you wrote the book, some international expansion insights, some stories about what has been done right and wrong, some of the failures. Again, we are also talking about outlier stories, a little bit of the mindset we need to bring into the table in order to be able to build a global class, the name of the book, company. And so I know that you also have some tools and playbooks and resources in the book, and two of the tools that you talk in your website promoting the book is balanced localization and complexity as you scale, and you kind of have a draw combining go-to-market strategy with operational strategy, initial market, product market fit, etc. And you also have the implement the 4 commitments for successful growth, the second tool. Of course, we will not have enough time to cover all of those, but just to give an example, what is the most interesting tool or resource that you'd like to talk about for people to get an understanding of how it can help them?
Since some people will be following this episode with video, is it okay if we show something just to give a little visual to everybody? Okay,
we need to just help the ones that are the majority.
Yeah, I'll still describe it. So what we're showing on the slide is this 2-step process. So essentially what we found is that the agile methodology in its pure form is not very effective in a global context. And the reason why is because the whole focus is to pivot and iterate and change until you find your right model. And that's great for one market. But if you do it in 5 or 10 markets, then what happens is you have 5 or 10 different models. And we found that a lot of companies, they have this muscle that they've built by getting product market fit in their initial market to just like speed at all costs. We're going to find product market fit. So they go, great, let's just go do it again in 4 or 5 different places. And then all of a sudden they hit a brick wall because, they're like, oh, wow, now we have 5 or 10 different models. We didn't build for scale. And so part of what we built is these different tools to help you consider scale from the beginning. And so one of them is what we label as like a global layer on top of Agile. And we've been, really blown away with the support we got. So our book and methodology was endorsed by Eric Ries, by Steve Blank, by Alex Osterwalder, sort of the big titans of Agile.
Definitely. Congrats.
But essentially you have to revisit that customer development mentality. Don't do what Walmart did, which is assume the company way is going to work in another market, but you don't want to swing the whole other way and just attempt to localize everything sort of blindly. So to make it actionable, we basically created what we call the business model localization canvas, which I'm showing on the screen here, which, is kind of, reminiscent of like a business model canvas. And for those of you seeing this, you'll recognize the different rows match the quadrants of the business model canvas. But essentially what you do is you take that validated model from your initial market and you run it through 2 key filters to get to a new set of hypotheses to then go test and iterate on in the new market. And those 2 key filters are government regulation and culture, because those 2 things really affect almost everything. And to a certain extent of what you were saying, Mike, before, is sometimes some of that, especially related to government regulation, is even at like a state or local municipality level, as opposed to just even a country level. But, one of the categories here, key partners, Klaus told the story of DocuSign, where culturally signatures were different in Japan. So you have to consider that. And DocuSign was successful because they considered the cultural side and created that key partnership with Sachihatta. On the government side, a lot of countries require that an international entity, an international company, create a local joint venture partnership or have a local board or things like that. They won't let an international entity own 100% of a local entity. And so you have to think about those types of things. Now, to your point around complexity, there's a little yin and yang we're showing. So localization is one side, but you have to manage the complexity of it and not make it an afterthought. And so what we created as part 2 of the global agile methodology is a localization premium analysis. We use the word premium because there's often a cost associated with localizing, but a benefit you get as well. And what this is a spider chart that basically has a holistic look at everything you might need to adapt in order to find fit in a new market. So initial product market fit is in the middle, but you have to deviate away from that to get fit in a new market. The top part is go-to-market related. The bottom part is operational. And you can see in there's a faint watermark of an iceberg. And we use that analogy because some companies will simplistically think like about the go-to-market side. Oh, we got to change the language and the pricing and the marketing message, and we're good. Like that's all we need. But there's so much under the surface you have to think about. So the way to think of this tool is it's something that helps you. And we have actually a very detailed analysis, like Excel, Google Sheets based tool that basically helps create the beginning of a brain trust as you're researching a market, helps you develop the strategy and then bridges toward implementation. And so this can be a great tool to help communicate what some of those changes need to be.
And maybe just to add to that final comment that Aaron just made in terms of creating a brain trust, that is often what is forgotten when companies try to build for global scale. What often happens is that they don't build these systems that allows for information sharing and knowledge sharing as well. And so to the point of my experience in Vietnam, when we came in and had to develop the go-to-market strategy for new product launches, in some cases, they barely knew where their products were placed of the old brand that they had, which is tragic, right? As a big organization, they don't know where things are placed. And so it's really important to build these systems, because then also, the insights you capture from Vietnam could maybe be used in other locations as well in terms of the go-to-market strategy implementation, right? And so really making sure you also speak at a GM to GM level, if you will, and have this information sharing and playbooks that you mentioned in the early part of today's conversation, right? That's incredibly key. Now over to more what we talk about initial preparation as well. It's important to have essential commitments as an organization. One is that resource alignment piece that you also addressed a little bit earlier, but we make the point that it's not just a launch and then leave type of concept, but it's more about how can we add minimal resources in to test the market and then build up milestones where you then unlock additional resources down the road. Another aspect that we talk about is autonomy and trust. That's incredibly key. On the autonomy side, when you're a local team, you need to have high level of autonomy, because you need to do discovery in that market, right? You need to go out and kind of figure out, okay, how do we need to adapt this business model? And then obviously you need to align with corporate strategy down the road as well, so that autonomy then decreases a little bit. And then later, once you start to build for that maturity, you start to increase the autonomy as well, because you want to capture more market share in that market. Then we have communication and clarity, where we talk about the importance of building feedback loops. That's key as well, to the point of brain trust and developing these communication channels, not just between GMs, but also with the headquarter, is absolutely critical to be successful. Because obviously we say that, from, let's say, the headquarter side of things, they need to communicate, vision, core values, culture, etc. That becomes a little bit the guiding light for decision making for local teams. And then local teams need to share local market insights back to the headquarter, and these two parties need to align in terms of what is the strategy for that local market. Where do we localize, but where do we also sort of balance a little bit that with that complexity piece as well? And then the commitment to our global agile process that Aaron shared a little bit about earlier, right? So these are some of the essential things that we key in on the book.
And definitely it kind of makes me think about what happens a lot on the expansion from Europe to the US, when the CEO moves himself to the US to be able to be much faster in decision making, and also to be able to have an understanding of the market, of course, being surrounded by people who know much better the market than themselves and who are native. But again, those people, if they don't have the power of decision and the speed of decision, and someone who can be an ambassador of the business in that market and show commitment for the business in that market, it's definitely really important. Amazing tools that we have shared today. Super happy.
So yeah, to the point, like people wise, this was one of our big discoveries, and this is pretty core to our mission, because we realized that there are these certain people, and one more time I'll show a slide just to give a little visual. We used the term earlier, entrepreneur, as an international, and this is a term we coined to really describe who these catalysts for successful expansion were. There's a certain mindset that they had in common, and while the entrepreneurial community is really well connected, this community of expansion executives is not as much, because often it was a very solitary experience. Like, you are focused on other markets, everybody else is focused on the initial market or core existing markets. You're shouting, like Klaus was talking about, you need resources and things are different here. And so we really wanted to bring these people to the forefront, so companies were more mindful of identifying and nurturing this type of talent. And essentially what it is, on the page, there's a pyramid, like a triangle. On the bottom is the agile or entrepreneurial mindset that's been around forever. The middle is the company mindset or being an intrapreneur, the idea of being able to be agile, but work within the complexity and bureaucracy of an established organization. But what hasn't been talked about as much that we see as this mindset of the next generation of companies that will be global class and successful at global scale is a cultural mindset. So global mindedness, cultural curiosity, cultural sensitivity, the ability to have empathy for another market to help localize that business and be successful in penetrating and getting scale in that market. And so one of our big things is really to help companies, put a word behind this, identify these type of people and use them as catalysts, whether that's in local markets or at headquarters. This is a mindset that really can permeate all levels of an organization, all functions. It's that cultural mindset that's the key.
Just add a few comments here to it as well, or maybe some stories to it. You see these people in the background, Abe Smith on the right. We often talk about they have these formative experiences that led them on the path to build a global career. Abe Smith was an English teacher in a rural fishing village in Kyushu, Japan. That sort of gave him the understanding that things are very different from his backyard on the East Coast of the US. So he really got this passion for international career and cultures from that early formative experience. Troy Malone in the middle, he was on a mission in Korea for 2 years in the early 90s, learned Korean. Now I've helped Weebly, Evernote, and now Drata expand to multiple countries and markets. And Catherine Himes on the left, she led product expansion for Slack. And she was the first international intern for Baidu in China, actually. Also a formative experience. And so part of also what we say is that we want to nurture more of these entrepreneurs, because in a world that's more divided, these days in terms of conversation point, we want to have these entrepreneurs bringing the world more together. People who are culturally conscious and interested in connecting to different worlds and different countries. And so it's really, really important, also a little bit of a social mission for us to kind of nurture more of this type of talent.
It's definitely also the mission of the podcast and the community that we put together every single week, bringing all the regions a little bit closer and getting an overview from different perspectives, different angles. I think that's really, I'm very passionate about this, and also having the opportunity to be talking with an American entrepreneur or an entrepreneur based in the US, then in LATAM, then in Southeast Asia. It brings a lot of diversity and freshness into the conversation. And guys, I know that you have big news this week about the book. Congratulations in advance. Of course, there is a gap in the recording of 2 or 3 weeks, depending on our pipeline of episodes, but so this happened kind of 2 or 3 weeks ago. But what is it?
I guess both of us can share it, right? But I mean, this has been a very formative week for us as well. We've been working 2 years for this, and part of the goal was to get it to what we got it to last week, and that was to make it a bestseller, right? And so we were announced 2 times last week that we were a national bestseller and also Wall Street Journal bestseller. So, and it
number 2 on the Wall Street Journal business book.
Number 2. And it absolutely could not have happened without meeting people like you along the process as well, in meeting with international business leaders who have these experiences that we could bring into play in the book, in building the playbook. So there's a little bit of rap there or something, I don't know, in the middle of it. but anyway, it couldn't have happened without the community.
Love it. Awesome. And before we go, we will not do the usual quick question and answer that we do at the end, because we decided to focus much more on the sides of the book and to share with the community some of the lessons that you guys collected in the last 2 years and 300 plus interview or 400 plus interviews that we did around the world. So we also try to give as much value as possible, sharing some of the resources, some of the common mistakes. But I would like to ask you both one question, which is very self-reflective. If you would have an opportunity to have a coffee with yourself at the beginning of your journey in the tech ecosystem, what advice would you offer to your younger self? Klaus, would you like to start?
Sure. Maybe I'll still a little bit of the book theme here. Maybe don't judge the book by its cover, and be naturally curious. And the reason why I'm saying this is a little bit of my experience having lived in another country. Early, I think it was around like 2006. I went to Chile the first time, and I ended up staying with a Chilean family back then, for around 3 weeks. And in my education, I've always been told that Pinochet, the famous dictator, is, the baddest dictator of them all and everything, which obviously there's some truth to that, right? But I actually ended up, living in a family's house where the mother and the father was absolutely adoring Pinochet. In fact, there was pictures of her kissing Pinochet on the cheek. And that for me was a big cultural shock. And almost like created this animosity towards the family. But I allowed myself the time to be curious, to learn about the family, and ended up really being so close to them that we ended up becoming a family. They call me their foreign, international son or whatever. And I call them my Chilean family because they're so kind and sweet. So don't judge the book by its cover, and don't, really just assume things just because there may not be a full alignment in certain things in terms of how you view life as well. So be open and curious.
So, Harun.
My answer to that would be, you don't always have to do things in order. I think a lot of times people will set like, this is a certain path I want to take, and these are the steps I need to take. And there's a number of opportunities that I've had and things that I've done that if I stuck to too rigid of a path, I never would have been open to it. So I guess part of that is being open to opportunity, but like, I didn't think that I was going to start teaching at UC Berkeley, the School of Business, when I was like in my mid 30s, right? I thought like, oh, maybe that's something I could do when I'm 60 years old after I've retired and stopped. But you don't have to do things in order. Be open to opportunities. What I would say.
It's also the tech world, right? The speed. I think that's just in the last 10 years with Scaleup Valley, we've been experiencing so much in such a short period of time that it's difficult to explain, right? So every single year, it seems kind of 5 or 10 years, helping companies to scale different problems, and also I think that in this kind of companies, high growth companies, it's also the emotional intensity of those cultures, of those companies, the huge or the high ambition of those companies also allows us to grow very, very quickly, right? And what I like also to think is what we consider a failure in this scene, and this is also a reflection for the ones who are listening, is a huge victory outside of this scene, right? So
right. Exactly. Isn't that crazy? I think part of it too is a lot of this path that startups have, or these rules that set, they limit you, right? Like a lot of companies will be like, okay, well, we have to get into Y Combinator or some accelerator. Exactly. And then after that, we do this, and then we do this, and then we raise this round and this round. And that's not always the case, and there's goods and bads for following that path.
Let me change the word failing on this podcast a little bit. Just so I want to put that out there because you mentioned that word, but think of it as, the word fail, F-A-I-L. Consider it more as being first attempt in learning. We learned that from Robin Larson from Shopify.
Love it.
I think it's a great way of thinking about it, right? It's a learning opportunity, right? So first attempt in learning when thinking about failing.
Love it. And there is not a better way of closing the show. Aaron, Klaus, thank you so much for making the time, for sharing your insights, and congrats for the
and also go to globalclassbook.com. There's tons of resources. We have a podcast too. We have a masterclass of all these experts we've been talking about who share targeted things. There's tons of great resources.
Awesome. And Mike, we hope to see you in Portugal soon as well. So we want to set up that while we're in town also.
Likewise, looking forward to it. And to our community, as you see, we keep bringing you the best of the best to help your life becoming a little bit easier, scaling up your company. See you soon, and keep scaling.